Chapter 2. Lyra. The heady scent of cactus flowers permeated the capital square of Shayal City, where a raised platform had been constructed out of shale blocks and mortar. The platform had 5 corners, as was proper in honor of Ea. Surrounded by curated palms and smooth-skinned palmate cacti, the central plaza of Shayal attracted the wealthiest clientele and the greatest amount of patronage for the wayfarers' stalls. Lyra stepped onto the platform to the raucous sounds of applause and ear-piercing whistles. She blushed, but raised her chin with an open smile, as her mother had taught her to do. The crowd was harmless, and hopefully generous. To one side, a secondary stage featured narrow stone columns, which held an airy white awning, stretched tight against the beating sun. The musicians, including her mother Eliza, drew their bows and plucked their strings in blessed shade. Mam strummed on a sitar, and the first few notes twanging out to the crowd caused passers-by to pause. Her skillful fingers danced into a teasing melody, and Lyra twirled into the center of the stage, her layered skirt flailing with ruffles. Shining silver coins flickered in the bright desert light, accompanied by the shaking of the copper bells that edged her skirting. To the crowd, it was the dance of Meridi the Virgin, the ecstatic and teasing whirlwind of motions danced by Meridi, maiden of the mountains, after she escaped a man of dark intentions. The man pursued her across the holy mountains, trampling holy ground with blind anger and evil in his heart. And so, Ea and the gods of the earth had damned him to chase his futile desires for eternity. They had given Meridi's dance to all of the wayfarer caravans. Mam called it the mocking dance. Every wayfaring maiden was taught to dance, to twirl, to tease, and to conceal the maiden Meridi securely in their midst. Lyra danced, her lithe body moving in a whirl of brilliantly dyed silks. The copper bells tinkled furiously as she moved across the platform, bouncing and swinging her hips in time to her tambourine. For a while, she was lost in it, alight with the ecstasy of moving in time with the thrum of the sitar and the shivering whine of the strings. The air danced around her as much as she danced through it, her silent, twirling partner. She finished with a flourish that flared her skirts outward in a mesmerizing display, leaving her lightly panting with the exertion. Controlling her breath beneath her tightly bound corset, as well as her demeanor, Lyra maintained an effortless and flirtatious smile on her lips. There was a theater to this, but also pure pleasure as her body synchronized with the rhythm vibrating from each instrument. The music shivered through her entire being. The crowd, mostly men, drowned her with applause, and she caught her breath while watching her little brother Eldon slip through the throng, relieving several well-heeled men of their coin. Lyra hid any hint of grimace. She didn't support the theft, but many of her watchers emptied their pockets on the stage regardless. It made no matter. With a final curtsy, her lips split apart into a real, joyful smile. Lyra left the stage, allowing a storytelling orator to step forward. He launched into elaborate gesticulations with the commanding voice that quieted the crowd. Mam took her hand and squeezed it. "Your best performance yet, Benishal," she gushed, brushing Lyra's wild hair back and kissing her forehead. Lyra blushed again, still grinning. Mam always called her that, a word from the old language. It meant gift or blessing, although Lyra would have reserved that name for Eldon, her unexpected little brother who had arrived in an undue season and barely survived infancy. Mam led the way to the wayfarers' market stalls, which were more temporary. Constructed of thin fabric and wooden poles, the tent-like stalls could be constructed swiftly in any market in which the caravan settled, and deconstructed just as fast. Several men nearly tripped on Lyra's skirts they were following so closely. She could hear their hopeful commentary, wondering whether the maiden Meridi had perhaps dropped something, or might need a cool drink or a handkerchief, or, more brazenly, whether she needed a cozier place to stay for the night than her family's airy caravan wagon. Mam glared most of them away, unless their cloaks were rich with dye and fastened with golden brooches, and Lyra ignored them all. Despite some suave words and a few somewhat handsome faces, most of these men were unworthy. Her maidenhood was a closely guarded commodity after all. Mam said it was valuable enough that its sale could purchase Lyra a sedentary life, one with a bed that didn't jostle in wagon ruts or radiate dust when you adjusted the furs. That was what Mam thought anyways. Lyra wasn't so sure, given her wayfarer blood, but she knew she wasn't willing to give up such a precious part of herself to just anyone. She may have been born a wayfarer, or maunderer, as most people called her, but if she was chaste, she might be pretty enough to serve as wife to a young baron or knight. To have land, to have servants even. She could hardly imagine what such a life was like. To have a place to come home to made of timber and stone, with a woven rug, and even a wall hanging. To have a pretty window made of glass that looked out on a garden during summer, that sparkled with frost as it guarded the house from winter's chill. To have a fireplace, with a chimney that emitted a curl of white smoke, heralding visitors' welcome. And her husband, a kind and simple landed man. Perhaps he would be a knight, born or elevated to nobility, but perhaps not. She didn't care either way, only that he might be gentle, giving her a peaceful life, that he might open his doors to her family's caravan when they passed through, and not look at her like she was lesser. Maunderer. It was a secret desire shared between Lyra and Mam, the bright spark of hope that she, unlike her mother, might rise above the scorn given to their kind. The silver-tongued followers, recognizing defeat before they made complete fools of themselves, dissipated into the market crowd. Lyra released a small sigh of relief. Although she did dream of marrying well, and lighting Mam's eyes up with joy and relief, she didn't think any of those men were the one. Usually, the ones who hounded her immediately were rude, overflowing with brazen words they said were brought on by her irresistible dress and dance. Pathetic excuses to get a closer look at her cleavage, according to Mam. That same physique, however, would eventually draw the eye of someone more worthy. Someone like them had to somehow garner that attention in the first place, before having the vaguest hope for marriage negotiations. The suitor would find so much more beyond that, though, if only he would look long enough. Eldon met them at the leatherwork stall, an enclosed tent where Mam sold their tanned hides, worked belts and straps, and fine sheaths and purses. Eldon broke into a mischievous, gap-filled grin. Only one adult tooth pushed its way out of his gums. He reached for one of his hidden pockets, but Mam stopped him with a subtle flick of her hand. The tent flap was parted by two men, each vying for first entry. "Bright day," said one, nodding to Mam and Lyra. He wore a long, light cloak with tattered edges where it swept across the ground. Lyra gave a slight curtsy. Apparently not all of the crowd's men had given up. "It's a pleasure to host such a talented wayfarer caravan here in Shayal," the man began. "Miss Lyra of the Mascalan caravan, my daughter." Mam's tone was utterly polite, smooth as the silk of Lyra's skirts and sonorous with the notes of a contralto singer. Yet it was also edged, imperious. Her eyes dropped down to the man's ratty cloak edge as she took his measure, and her lips tightened. "Miss Lyra, what a lovely name," said the man, avoiding Mam's direct gaze by fawning at Lyra. "And you have just arrived in the city." "We have." Mam spoke for Lyra, who stared at the floor with her jaw set and her cheeks burning. "The caravan brings goods to trade for those with a spare penny. Sir." She gestured at the display tables with her eyebrows raised, just enough to look doubtful. The man minced over the wares, then subtly patted his pocket, and subsided, a half-controlled look of dismay painting his face. He bowed again. "I hope to see you again tomorrow, Miss Lyra." He backed out of the tent and disappeared into the throng of the plaza. The second man watched him go with disdain, then stepped forward and took Lyra's hand. He gave it a soft kiss, as a noble or high-ranking guildsman would do, then bowed deeply. "Poor men have no place speaking to a young lady like you," he said, his derision obvious. "Thank you, sir," said Lyra. Her politeness was more genuine than Mam's, although less practiced. Mam was doubtful of every man who pursued her, but this one looked like a reasonable option. His cloak was a fine-spun fabric, not quite silk, but smooth in texture and tightly woven, and dyed a unique shade of blue. His open-toed sandals indicated not only that he could afford leather as fine as that produced by the Maskilan caravan, but also that his labor did not require boots. His face was clean-shaven, and although he was a bit older than Lyra would have preferred, he had no silver streaks in his dark hair. He addressed Mam with a bow far more respectful than was due to a wayfarer. "May I beg your name, madam?" "Eliza Olmaskilan, sir," replied Mam with a pleased expression. The man launched into pleasantries with them, extolling their leatherwork and fine products with what seemed to be a genuine knowledge. He welcomed them to Shayal and bragged about his horses, who could use new straps and bridles. "Have you many horses?" asked Mam innocuously. "We have saddles as well, several quite fitting for a nobleman. Sir—" Again her deeper voice lilted high, inquiring after the man's name and rank. A partial smirk crossed the man's face, which he covered by turning toward the table. For a moment, Lyra saw a disturbing level of arrogance. He said his name, but she didn't hear it as her internal thoughts raged against each other in a sea of doubt. Which was better? A rich nobleman with an absolute assurance of his own excellence, or a poorer man who was more earnest but less prideful? "I do, madam," the man went on. Mam pulled a saddle from beneath the table. It was embedded with the ornate gems mined in Shayal, a fine example of the Maskilan blending of northern commodities and southern design. The man marveled over it, explaining that his steward was in need of a new saddle. Lyra's mouth almost dropped open. A gem-studded saddle for a steward? She controlled herself as Mam caught her eye. Mam had Eldon pull several other saddles out that had been tucked away for security, her attitude growing friendlier and friendlier as the man extolled their individual virtues. Clearly, he met at least some of her requirements. Lyra's stomach churned as she answered the man's intermittent questions. Something about him grated, and it wasn't only his age. That wasn't all too important in the end. It was something in the way he spoke, as though he were talking to a child, never asking difficult or interesting questions, only grazing superficial and empty topics and then disregarding her answers. Polite and meaningless. Was that the life she had to look forward to? "I'll send my servants to retrieve it all tomorrow, then," said the nobleman, handing Mam a clinking purse. "Shall you accompany them, sir?" Mam inquired. "We'd be pleased to see you again." The man straightened his shoulders and raised his chin, preening over himself. "I had hoped I might return this evening, if it pleases Miss Lyra." Lyra berated herself as she put on a show of agreement and excitement. Arrogant or not, this man couldn't possibly be that bad. He was giving them business, and he was polite. If he was high-ranked, he must have a reason to be proud of his nobility. And besides, he couldn't broach more interesting topics while also bartering with Mam. Perhaps this evening he would take Lyra on a walk through one of the green oases tucked inside the noble house's high walls, and they could speak of their dreams and goals, their fears and their families. "As my lord pleases," said Mam. Lyra echoed her words, feeling the man's lips brush her fingers once more. Then he was gone. Mam placed her palm on Lyra's cheek. Her pale green eyes sparkled with excitement. "What a suitor, Maiden Maridi," she gushed in a low voice. "You carried yourself well. He's a man of high-born blood, being a baron. Your Uncle Tarasa will accompany you. She moved to the drawn tent flaps and loosed the strings, closing them off from the rest of the world. Ma'am, do you think he's kind? Her mother paused, then wrapped her arms around Lyra. He's landed, Benishel, and seemed kind enough. However, you will have to evaluate that yourself when he courts you this evening. Tarasa will report his impressions as well. Lyra leaned into the hug. Mam was thicker than she, but with the same long ringlets of pinkish blonde, although her mother's was a shade redder. Mam stroked the wild fray down and pressed Lyra's cheek into her shoulder. We won't make an agreement without ensuring you'll be well cared for, Benishel, she murmured. You're worth far more than that. I'm just a maunderer, Lyra thought. Mam must have felt her slight stiffening, for she pushed Lyra back and looked her in the eye. You deserve better than this life. You must believe that. Everything we strive for is to give you that dream. Lyra nodded obediently, and her mother released her. Then, Mam placed her hands on her hips and scowled at Eldon, who capered from foot to foot, nearly bursting. And you, little rascal, I think you might be the reason people believe wayfarers are nothing but thieves. Eldon produced coin purses from multiple pockets with a giggle, and their mother quickly stowed the gold away. She patted him on the head and bid him go. No more today, young bird, she called after him as he scampered into the crowd. A doleful smile stretched across her face as she turned to Lyra. Full of mischief, that boy is. Praise the light, you were never so intent on making trouble. She refastened the tent flaps open as wide as they would go, allowing the fresh desert air and sunshine in. They both stepped behind the main display table and worked the market, calling passers-by to their tent, not only for leather, but also for spells. Laughable things, spells. The minor workings of people blessed with far more magic than the customers of Shayal could comprehend. Spells of love, spells of hate, potions that could turn a man's bowels into jelly, and powders that could harden the heart for battle. These tiny scripts and mixtures were sometimes more profitable than the leather, despite the material's tangibility. This was especially the case in the more superstitious corners of the world, including Shayal. The northern regions had always been more superstitious than the south, perhaps because of the influence of the wild and magical peoples that resided beyond the edges of civilization. Past Shayal City lay the Tahai Desert, a temperate desert filled with nomadic tribes who had never been under the Empire's chokehold. Some were even said to have fire-filled blood, although she suspected that was a rumor without truth. On the eastern continent, it was known that the Fair People populated the grasslands at the edge of Merat, as well as the icy northern Merchan coast. Of course, these spells were low magicka, independent of one's blood or natural gifting. Almost anyone could practice some form of low magicka, although there were certain differences in talent and resulting efficacy. The Mascalan were quite gifted, as many wayfaring caravans were. Like the Fair People, they'd lived outside the structure of imperial rule 1,000 years ago, thereby escaping not only its politics, but its genocide of gifted commoners. Most of their wares were green magicka, the careful mixtures of herbs and flowers in various forms. Perhaps a bit of black. The metallurgic properties added substantial power to spells of strength and fear. The Mascalan didn't touch red magicka. It was too dangerous, with too many nefarious uses. Lyra winked playfully at a tight-lipped man as he bartered over a curse with her mother. His gaunt cheeks and bitter look implied that he was certainly going to close a deal, if only he would meet Mam's minimum. But then Mam hesitated. Her eyes, ever so briefly, moved beyond the miserable creature to a tall, barrel-chested man in royal attire, who stood in the entrance. He was accompanied by 8 knights with yellow capes edged in orange. Mam closed the deal quickly and took the tight-lipped man's coined pocket before dropping into a ground-level curtsy. Lyra curtsied as well, her eyes fixed on the lord's shoes. He wore fine riding boots, thicker-soled for riding with stirrups, but otherwise incredibly thin and supple. Although Lyra took them in, her focus remained on her peripheral, on Mam's composed expression. "Your Highness," her mother murmured, "you honor us with your presence. Do our wares please the king's eyes?" She kept her face trained to the ground, as did Lyra. King Hemel, ruler of the kingdom of Shayal, stepped carefully into the large tent and perused the display tables. "You may rise, lady," he said, removing his glove to touch each jeweled leather belt in turn. Mam eased Lyra up and back, moving all the way behind the table to give the king and his men space. "I require a belt for my nephew," King Hemel stated, his voice deep and gravelly. "He shall earn his first sword soon. Have you any gems hidden beneath the cloth? The Masculine usually do." Her mother let out a light chuckle. "My lord knows a wayfarer well." She summoned a belt wrapped in red silk and laid it upon the table with reverence. As she unfolded the silk, a ruby glimmered in the afternoon light. The belt itself was tanned and colored with a deep black burnish. Winking embedded rubies outlined the shapes of soaring birds. Each bird hung on the breadth of diamond wings, minute gemstones that sparkled in every direction. It shone like no belt Lyra had ever seen, a stunning gift worthy of a prince. King Hemel picked the belt up with gentle hands, a look of approval flashing across his face. Lyra finally gathered the confidence to glance at his expression in that moment, and was surprised by his handsomeness. His face was broad and brown like most people's in this part of the world, with a coarse but closely trimmed goatee and mustache. His loose curled hair was a deep dark brown reminiscent of the burnished belt, with silver streaks at each temple. Above all, his eyes were a shocking blue, stark against his sun-tanned cheeks. A handsome man, a lordly and authoritative man. The king was looking back at her, still holding the bejeweled belt. Aghast, Lyra returned her gaze to the ground, her cheeks burning with a furious, self-deprecating fire. "This is certainly an unexpected gem you have hidden away, wayfarer," King Hemel said, tracing the outline of each bird with a finger. "A gem worthy of a young lord." Mam huffed a small sigh of relief. "It pleases my lord, then?" "Yes. I always find such rare value in the humble tents of the Masculine. I'm grateful to the eye you returned to my fair city." Mam's smile creased the corners of her eyes, and Lyra could tell it was genuine. "Please, let this be a gift, then. From the Masculine caravan. My lord has always used us well, though it has been many long years since our wagons entered Shayal's capital." King Hemel shook his head. "Nay, lady, I cannot rightfully gift another's gift. I shall pay." "Very well." Mam closed the agreement with little bartering, giving the king a fair deal before curtsying deeply once more. "You honor the Masculine, your highness. May the light of Ea shine upon you always." Lyra mimicked her motion and words, still shocked at the king's presence and friendliness. King Hemel thanked them both with a gracious nod, then marched out with his escort. Mam watched the contingent of yellow-garbed knights, now mounted on gorgeous black stallions, disappear among the throng. Her expression was carefully sculpted in detached interest. Her red lips pursed and her cheeks flushed a light pink. "Ma'am?" Lyra inquired after a brief silence. "Was that really the king of Shayal? In our tent?" "Yes, Benishel. The King Hemel, Alis al-Shayal." Lyra giggled, all of her nerves frayed. "He's handsome." Mam shushed her. "You mustn't disrespect one of such high blood. We are only wayfarers, after all. Remember your place." She beamed at Lyra even as she said it, though, wrinkling her rounded nose. "Tread carefully, at least until you're secure in a noble house, a lady yourself, and bound to be mother to noble-blooded children." Scene break. Mam sent her to the wakeway as the reddening sun sent hazy golden rays across the baked steppe south of Shayal. The wayfarers' wagons were stationed on the southern edge of the city, not far from the lazy river that snaked through the city proper. The wakeway wound around a large cove, forming a crescent shape of docks and fish hawkers and trade stalls. At the middle, the wakeway intersected the Black Road, Shayal's main crossroad, which went straight to the center of the city, including the plaza in which Lyra had danced earlier. The Black Road spanned all the way from Shayal's southern cove to its northern edge, paved with perfectly squared malagate stones and partitioned with stone murals detailing Shayal's somber history. Shayal had a long and dark history, caught between the Tahai Desert clans, the aggression of the Empire, and 1,000 other infringements. Each event was etched into the hard malagate face, brought to life by a rainbow of paints and cheap gemstones. The War of the Triad, the Siege of Raymar when the High Temple burned, the invasion of the Harala thousands of years ago. Lyra needed only to pick up enough fish for Mam's evening stew, and then she would be free to join the noblemen for a short evening of social pleasantries. How glorious if she could see one of the Shayalese gardens, congested with outstretching fronds and overarching palms, occasional thorn trees with complex leaves and spice-smelling bean pods, and delicate flowers that could never thrive without extra water and care. She didn't waste any time, closing a deal with one of the rivermen for the basketful swinging in the crook of her arm now. The wares at the wakeway had been minimal, but adequate for a warm supper. The maskalon came from the southern edge of the larger trade sea, the Mauna Loa. The fish there carried spars on their bodies and shone like blue jewels in the ocean. Their flesh was thick, meaty, and satisfying. The lazy Shayalese river yielded somewhat less, its fish sparse and quite different. The small-bodied cichlid Lyra had purchased would be mild in flavor, a strange food, but good texture for the stew. She meandered toward the Black Road and its pretty murals, taking in the sharp, fishy scent and industrial sounds of men unloading their catch from the countless wooden skiffs anchored on each dock. She stopped to admire one particular carving. It was the tale of 5 kings. Lyra knew the tale, as everyone did, but she had never seen such a beautiful portrayal before. The images were engraved with the detail of a painting, with lighter etching giving the appearance of texture and shading on each figure. Gatlin the Grim's hard-set features glared stonily at the demon Mekasal. The Grim wielded an emerald-inlaid battle-axe high above his head. The black demon cowered, its smoky form shying from the fearsome power in Gatlin's gauntleted fist. It had no color, save in the eyes, which burned with hateful crimson acid. The Grim's armor shone with lesser green gemstones, forming the ancient signet of Kalandera. His chainmail was flecked in obsidian, and his eyes gleamed a deep, calm jade. In stark contrast to the Grim's serenity as he delivered death, Shasted the Boy King grinned wide as he swung a massive battle hammer upon the demon Mekharar. The Boy King's mouth was half open with utter delight, and bloodlust shone in his wild eyes. His brawny figure was far from diminutive, towering over the other warrior kings, and his Alicite armor was painted in silver. Lyra pondered the mural from an appropriate distance that wouldn't draw the guard's ire. She relived the battle to which she sometimes danced. The 5 Kings' dance was far less joyful and light than what she had displayed that afternoon. It required an entire team, which marched against each other in a rhythmic war drumbeat. The violent clashing of their prop weapons was accompanied by shakes of the tambourine and the pounding of boots on stage. A shadow fell over Lyra, and a pair of yellow-gloved hands grabbed her and yanked her into an alley. Shoved against a wall, she peered into a guard's face. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" he snickered. Lyra spat in his eyes and pulled away, but his grip on her arm was sure. He slapped her, and a second guard grabbed her other arm with an indifferent expression. She'd do in a pinch." "Let me go," Lyra cried, dropping her basket of fish and wrenching one arm free. "Please," she thought, "if only that nobleman would appear with his knights. All I was doing was looking. I didn't touch the mural." "Stop struggling, Wanderer," said the first one. She didn't stop. She strained toward the black road with her entire body. Several passers-by stole glances toward her, and one even paused, but they all rushed on when they recognized the guards' uniforms. The second guard backhanded her cheek hard enough to knock her off balance, and she would have stumbled if not for the other's grasp. They dragged her farther into the alley and shoved her down. She landed with a huff as the breath was knocked out of her. Dust alighted, then resettled on her fine silk skirts. Lyra would have to change outfits before meeting the nobleman. Then she noticed expensive sandals in front of her, peeking out with the sparkle of diamonds from underneath a rough-spun cloak. Then a voice. "Look at me, Wanderer." That word. Lyra's hair was gripped and yanked back. She stared into the delicate, well-bred face of a noblewoman. The woman's eyes were like fire. Her gaze leapt from Lyra's eyes to her hair, to her clothes, back to her eyes again, jumping almost as if irritated. It made Lyra think of sweat bees, the ones that seem to touch every part of your arm before deciding which spot to bite. The woman beckoned Lyra to stand, and Lyra obeyed with trembling knees. She could feel the noblewoman's examination crawl over every part of her. She crossed her arms and looked down, but the woman grabbed her chin and wrenched it up to look her in the eye once more. The noblewoman inspected Lyra with a silent fury, and was it disgust? "Get rid of her." "But I didn't do—" Another slap, this time from the noblewoman. Her jewel-encrusted rings drew blood on Lyra's cheek, a fact that clearly irritated the woman even further. She sneered at Lyra with untempered hatred before turning away. The glittering shoes were gone. "As you please, my lady," one guard snickered and struck Lyra's skull from behind. They bagged her head and hauled her out of the alleyway without ceremony, dragging her, hacking and gasping in the filthy bag through the black stone streets of Shayal. Any time she tried to scream or protest, they would strike her again. Lyra kicked her feet out several times before being struck in the stomach and reprimanded, and then someone grabbed her legs and carried her. They removed the bag, revealing her surroundings, a dungeon, where they beat her until she collapsed on the damp stones. She shuddered, barely able to breathe with the sudden pain in her ribs and eye. Had they removed the bag merely so they could hit her in the face? Then they began to tear her clothes away, first pulling at the dyed leather corset, which she clutched to her body, then at her copper-belled skirt. Her screams were unrestrained now, but fruitless. No one would hear her in a dungeon. Panic bubbled up as she realized they might do more than hit her. "Be gone," came a wizened voice, "or I'll send you through the nether gates myself." Both soldiers paused, and their greedy looks fell into sullen disappointment. "I'll send your fucking balls separately if you take any longer. Out of my dungeon. Now." The old man, the dungeon keykeeper, pushed them out of the cell with a snarl, but not before one of them tossed Lyra against the wall. Her skull slammed into the rock with a crack that echoed through her mind, and she lay where they left her, a ruin of copper-belled silk and blood-spackled blonde curls.